Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict. I'm a futurist here at TCS, and I want to welcome all of you to the show today. I'm really excited about this program because this is a good friend of mine. We've worked for probably over more than a decade. We've known each other, and he spent a lot of time putting together a fantastic book, and we're going to be talking about that book. It just went to publication here, I think, January 3, so it's available everywhere now. I bought my copy on Amazon, and anyway, it's all there. So we'll talk a lot about that. Our guest is Ved Sen. He's a head of innovation in the UK and Ireland for TCS. He's a digital transformation expert, an innovation expert, and as I just mentioned, the author of a new book titled Doing Digital, the Guide to Digital for Non-Technical Leaders. Thanks for joining us, Ved.
Thank you, Kevin. It's wonderful to be here, and I've always enjoyed talking to you. So we're hoping we can have a really, really good conversation today.
Oh, yeah. So I'm calling in here from Boise, Idaho. Where are you at today?
At my desk in gloomy London. It feels like it's always that way, but it's not really. We do get good weather, but right now it's a bit overcast.
Oh, man. Well, let's talk about this book and some of the concepts in it. You know, when I open up the first section of the book, right off the bat, I see this acronym CQO, and that stands for the concept of connect, quantify, and optimize. Tell us about that, Ved.
So in a nutshell, it's really clearing up this confusion about the big story of digital transformation, which is what lots of organizations aim to do. And what we see, which is a little bit in the front, which is the new app or the new website or something that we've done, which is just helping clients or customers or users connect a little bit better. And it's showing us how we go from that connect all the way to optimizing businesses through the value of data, which is the quantify piece in the middle. I think we also need to recognize there's a virtuous cycle. Well-designed experiences lead to more data, which lead to the opportunity to change things. And I think successful companies, I'm sure we all know most of us know really interesting, smart companies, they don't see digital transformation as a one-time thing. It's always changing because we're on this virtuous cycle of connecting, quantifying, and transforming or optimizing. And I can give you a couple of really interesting examples. There's I don't know if you use Citymapper, which is the app for cities. You can kind of find, you can say, take me home or take me to work, or it'll tell you the most appropriate route between multimodal transport options. Now, they, about 3 or 4 years ago, launched a bus service in London, right? A real physical bus in conjunction with Transport for London, because their data told them that there were lots of people going from a certain point to another point, but they weren't served by a single transport link. So they had to change 2 or 3 times. And they said, well, if there are so many thousand people going from here to here, why don't we launch a bus route? So it became a pop-up bus route that was launched for a while. Now it wasn't core to their model, so they didn't continue running it. But what they've done in the last year is they built something called a stay cool route, because in summer the underground gets very hot and you're reaching high 30s and people are uncomfortable on public transport. So you can actually select a stay cool route and it'll give you an option so you can avoid the hottest parts of the transport system. I think that's fantastic because you're really tapping into what people are trying to do, but you're also changing an experience. And by doing that, you're also being able to identify which customers are going that way and then what else might they need. So, I think we'll see the same thing on hybrid work as well. Lots of companies, are looking to hybrid work right now. And if we start gathering data about our employees, when do they come in? How often do they need to use a desk in office? Because right now, I think most companies do it by gut. We think Wednesdays are the busiest times. And I've talked about this in the book. But if we could gather data, if you had everyone use their phone, and we were allowed to capture all of that data and then do proper analysis, we might come up with much, much more optimal ways of using our office space, making the hybrid experience better, truly understanding what people are trying to do. So you can point this at anything, but if you can deliver a great experience, which then allows people to use your service, which automatically gives you lots of data to play with, which then says, well, here's how I can actually improve my business to be even better.
That's brilliant. So Ved, you also in the book, you talk about smartphones, and you say that smartphones are effectively today's remote control of the world. I love that analogy because, it has occurred to me as well, like how much of our lives can we actually manage now? I have a cabin in the mountains, and we have security systems, and we can, see what's going on at any time. We can check on the weather there. We're setting it up so we can monitor the heat and turn on the heat before we get there. All of that stuff from the phone. And I just think it's terrific, but tell us more about that.
And you've got, what you said accurately describes the phenomenon already. But I think there are two phases to that. In the initial bit, we could consume a lot of digital devices. So just getting our heads around the fact that this is actually a computer in our pocket, not just a phone. The phone becomes just a feature of this device. Already gave us this wide range of services. But I think what's happening is, as the digital and physical worlds are starting to blend in more and more interesting ways, your phone then becomes better at picking up and managing aspects which are intrinsically physical, minus the phone or historically the way you would have done it. So in addition to the stuff you've talked about, which is great, we are now recording, you're using a smartphone to record television programs on your device. Otherwise, you have to walk up to it and fiddle with the buttons or your remote control. We, of course, use a lot of the device capabilities on transport systems. So it's become your credit card. It is going to become your identity holder at some point of time. We're already using it for things like, you're scanning a boarding pass, etc. During the pandemic, you could download a bit of QR code that would allow people to know that you were safe. All of these things, it just increasing the span of the number of things in our life that we are able to control through the smartphone. And I think this will keep going up. I think that it will, even though there is not a massive amount of new innovation that we're seeing in the short term on the device itself, I think the power of the phone will just keep going up for the next 5 to 10 years, and we'll be doing more and more of this.
Oh, yeah, because when we look at it, all of the football games that I miss because I'm out running around, when I come back, they're all available on my phone. I can watch all of them, or just the key plays for them, or anything. So, and it's not always on the phone, is it? Is access to the cloud. And we can talk more about that here in a little bit too.
Can I ask you, what's your favorite feature on your phone? What's the one thing that you would really struggle without?
Well, the fact that I can do everything with TCS on my phone. Seriously, so I don't have to be chained to a desk waiting for a message, waiting for a calendar invite, waiting for anything, because all of my core applications and my conversations with teams and my project management, everything is on my phone. So the ability just to slip that in my coat pocket and take everything I do with me, to me, is just incredibly powerful. The rest of the stuff, I document a lot of stuff through everything from audio to video to notes, just to be able to have the second brain, yes, with me. That's just powerful. And then to be able to back that up and protect it as well.
I have a particularly favorite one, which is very dear to me, which is on cold mornings, I can use my phone to defrost the car.
Oh, yeah.
That is a lifesaver. When you don't have to get into a cold car in the morning and the windows are completely frosted. Those 10 minutes, I can tell you, it makes. Oh,
yeah. Matter of fact, I have that now too. I have this, very cool Jeep that I drive in the mountains, and it has that function too for my phone. Start it up, get it all warmed up, get it ready. I love it. Yes. So also in your book, you write about this concept, the value of presence. Now, why do you feel presence is an important concept for leaders to think about?
The holy grail for pretty much any business that you can think of is you want to be there with your customers when they need you. right? If you gave a CEO a magic wand, I think that would be pretty high on the list. When my clients or my customers need me, I'm there, because that's the way to build an incredibly long-term, successful, mutually beneficial relationship. And I think we are now able with digital technologies to kind of provide for that kind of presence. You don't have to walk somewhere, as you just said. You don't have to go somewhere. You don't have to be at a specific device. Wherever you are, we can be there with you. That's incredibly powerful, right? I mean, that's changed banking. Everyone can now bank from wherever they are. It's changed pretty much the service delivery of almost all utility services and a whole host of others. So people have started using presence incredibly powerfully, but you could even apply it to things like, if you remember the Amazon Dash buttons, right? Now, not every idea works well, but the concept of it, which is when I run out of detergent, I can just press a button and it'll automatically order it. Or now I can use Alexa to add to a shopping list. That's all little bits of presence, right? I'm there when you need me. You're not putting the onus on the user or the customer to remember it, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour later when they're actually making the list. So I think that's very powerful. And I think you can, again, apply the same thing to internal employee facing when you've got users in your office. As an organization, are you there when your employees need you? Are you providing you talked about the TCS example, the ability for a company to give you what you need when you need it is again, I think, a game changer in today's world. And I think if you're not doing that today, then you're really missing out.
So I've written about that before. I use this acronym called contextually relevant opportunities, moments, and environments, which is there's opportunities to meet these digital interaction points where we're doing certain things and we have certain needs at certain moments and certain times at certain places. So that's the idea. What are the things you need in that context at that moment? And the ability to carry your mobile phone. Oh, that's such a powerful idea there.
You know what the mobile phone has done is it's changed how we value time. Because now, as you just said, because in 5 minutes, you can perform a task, right? If you're at a bus stop, if you're on a train, that's not dead time anymore. So it's changed how we as users and consumers value our time. Because if I can if I can use 5 minutes to complete a banking transaction, I'm less happy to be waiting on a phone call while I'm in a queue waiting for someone to answer my query. So I think it's changed the way we as users and customers of services start to think about micro time modules, and if they can become more powerful and more productive, why not?
Oh, yeah. And I know we're going to talk about this in a moment here, Ved, but I love being able to communicate with my healthcare professionals, my doctors, my nurses, and built into their platforms now are just messaging apps. So just like you message family members and friends, you message with your healthcare provider, and they send you, a diagnosis or a test result. You can just text back and forth instead of having to schedule another meeting or wait for them to have availability on the phone. So it's a different way of interfacing. So let's talk about digital transformation. Part of the importance of digital transformation is a company's journey toward automating decisions. Now, do you agree or disagree with that?
That's a really interesting one. I would look at that as a journey, and there are a few steps in that journey. I think if I flip the kind of current working model on its head and kind of turn the clock back historically, you could argue that one of the outcomes of the Industrial Revolution is that we've made people into robots, production lines where we've said, we don't need your brain, we just need your hands, and you have to just perform this one task. I think the first level of automation is just peeling back that robotic work, which we've had humans do, which maybe if you had to design it today, you would never ask humans to do that. So there's a level of automation which is much more process oriented. There's a layer above that, which is process plus intelligence, where you're performing a process, but you need some judgment. You could be screening resumes, you could be doing credit risk analysis. It's still step by step, but there are bits where you have to engage your mind, and that's where you start to get into intelligent automation. But the top level is really where you will put the process to one side, but really focus on decision making and look at how we automate those. And I think that's the world we're in the process of stepping into as we speak right now. And I think we're things like medical diagnosis, macroeconomic modeling, or even vendor selection for a large company, which is a complex, tricky project, and a problem that has many different dimensions. We're able to get into how we model those and how we automate decisions like that. And I think that's very powerful. So I absolutely think that the kind of trajectory of digital automation and transformation to get towards decision automation over the next years.
So I speak a lot about blind spots, the notion of if you're going to automate a process, there's data that you need that you might not have. So how do you find those blind spots and identify, okay, I don't know what happens in that dark room back there. I don't know when something gets delivered or removed or what actually even happens back there, but I know it impacts my process here. So, and the lack of insight into those kinds of things can completely stop or prevent automated decision-making, or at least negatively impact it. So what advice do you have for leaders on how to identify data blind spots and then fix those?
Before I answer that question, Kevin, I have to ask you something. You mentioned your Jeep, and it always strikes me as interesting that we've had cars for 100 years, but we still have blind spots in our driving vision. Why? I mean, this is something that always bugs me, because you mentioned blind spots. It's amazing that we still drive millions of miles collectively, and we've still got this bit that we just don't know what's going on. So
yeah,
the original blind spot we still need to solve for. But to your question, I think blind spots are fundamental in decision making, and I think the way to solve them is, first of all, we have to make it second nature to gather data for decisions we make, even if we know the answer. And I think I can't overstate how important this is, because most of us are used to making decisions on the back of our intuition, our knowledge, our experience. And of course, there are decisions you make every day which are very intuitive, and you never think about data when you say, should I walk out of my house with my house keys? But you are making a decision at every point, right? Now, when we make decisions at work, we tend to kind of make them with the kind of mindset of the system one brain, which is we are making it intuitively without thinking. I think for work decisions, we have to start collecting data. Second step is when we get the data, we then actively start to compare where there is a different answer that we're getting from data vis-a-vis what we would have normally done. And it's those distinction between the data answer and our intuitive answer where the real excitement is, because that's our blind spot, right? Why is the data telling us something else, right? It can happen sometimes that maybe the data is inaccurately gathered, or sometimes as a manager, you have to override the data because the data is historical, and sometimes you're getting into a space where the data does not project. But sometimes a blind spot isn't just wrong, it's just suboptimal, right? It's like I've been using a particular way to get to office, and I've never thought about it. And now that I have my smartphone and I can see the time it takes and the modes of transport, I can actually compare across 3 different modes and say, hang on a second, this one's 10 minutes faster. So it's not that I've been wrong, but I could be doing it 10% better. And that's important in business. So I think there is certain scenarios where blind spots arise because of habit. Certain times blind spots arise because the landscape is changing. And so what was right yesterday isn't right today anymore. But we don't know that because that change is subtle. So data gives us that superpower to shine a light on those blind spots. But I think it needs that culture change in ourselves to start becoming much more data aware in our decision making.
Oh, yeah. And especially when companies are more interested in sustainability and supporting like the UN Sustainability Development Goals, things like that, where they want to be able to be accountable and report on not only their first tier suppliers, but their second tier and their third tier suppliers. Are they using child labor? Are they interested in protecting their employees with the appropriate safety measures and environmental measures? All of this kind of stuff, we lose visibility quickly when our suppliers have suppliers and they have suppliers. And, I can see those are all blind spots because most companies can go, okay, I can hold accountable my first level suppliers. After that, I get blind to what's actually happening in my own supply chain. So that's another example of that. But the answer is not just throwing a lot more sensors out there, is it? I mean, there might be some value in some places, but you could quickly bury a leader with out of context data. So what advice do you have where you could turn mountains of censored data into valuable information for leaders? How do you even approach that?
It's a fascinating question. Can I ask you, Kevin, who shops for groceries in your house?
Both of us kind of equal.
Right. So if you go to Walmart, a typical Walmart store has 140,000 SKUs. There are 140,000 things to choose from in Walmart, right? And the reason why I am not allowed to go grocery shopping in my house is because I go in and say, well, let's have that and let's have that. And I'm not thinking about what I'm choosing. My wife goes grocery shopping. She has a clear plan of what she wants to cook and therefore what we're going to eat on Friday and therefore what we need to buy now. I think that's the mindset we need to your question if you're running a business, if you're a leader, you need to be going from your decision back to your data, not the other way around. It's very easy to throw a lot of data around, as you said. We know lots of companies where people write reports. This report has been generated for the last 5 years. It always gets, and there's 13 copies of it goes to these guys, and it sits on their desks, and no one ever reads it, but we generate it nonetheless because that's what we do. And I think if you flip that model and say, for any data we're generating, let's first ask the question, what is the decision we want to make here? And then we can ask the question about what data do we need to support the decision? Are we getting it? Are we not getting it? And then if we're not getting it, yes, then let's bring in the sensors. And I do agree that there are things today that we can do with sensors that we just haven't thought of. So there is a scope for us to make people aware of what's possible. Did you know you could get this data? Did you know you could count every car on the street if you wanted to? And you could kind of put sensors on a road and figure out which is the quietest time of the week to do a bit of road work. You don't have to go by your judgment or an estimate because that could be wrong.
So I think undoubtedly we live in a very fast changing world. So how can we deal as leaders with the speed of change? What advice do you have for us?
There are probably three things I would look at. The first is exponentials, right? This is almost like having the power to see around corners because nothing we have done in our lives and most of our education, it doesn't teach us to think non-linearly. We are habituated to think, if this is the direction we're going, we'll keep going this way, and we can't kind of see what's around there. And exponential is a bit like that. It's almost looking at a car and not seeing its speed, but it's seeing its acceleration. And what we're expecting people to do with this kind of fast-changing world is notice the acceleration and not the speed, because that's what will tell you where the car will be in 3 minutes, not the exact speed now. And I think that's a skill that you have to build. And I think it takes a lot of, it takes practice. And some people are good at it. You have companies like Amazon and famously Jeff Bezos talks about in his book, I think it's called Invent and Wonder. He talks about when he realizes that the price of bandwidth and storage and compute will all be dropping. And those are his biggest costs. And this is in the late 90s. And he realizes that no one will ever be able to touch him on economics if you compare physical stores to the Amazon store. And I think that's that light bulb moment of recognizing you're on an exponential curve. So that's the first thing. The second thing I think is just faster execution cycles. This is like calculus. When things are changing fast, the only way to deal with it is to break it up into smaller chunks. And in that small chunk, maybe things won't change so fast that by the time you've finished executing, it's irrelevant because it doesn't matter. Things have changed. So I think what we want to do is to execute faster, because that's a bulwark against change in some ways, because small bits of change will keep you in pace with the speed of change around you. And the last thing is to be comfortable with this idea of unknown unknowns. In this fast changing world, we have a lot of unknown unknowns. And I think the way to deal with that, and we talk about this in the book as well, is to think about organizations have become very lean. We cut every bit of spare because we are focused on efficiency. Whereas a world that focuses on resilience as opposed to efficiency preserves a bit of fat because you don't know what you'll encounter on the next corner. It's almost like saying, when you don't know when your next meal is coming from, your body will naturally store a bit of extra fat. Genetically, we become dispossessed towards that. And I think we need organizations also to start thinking about retaining some capability that isn't committed to running today's business, so that we can deal with those unknown unknowns and those changes. So unknown unknowns, fast execution, and learning to live with exponentials, I think, are the three things we have to think about.
I have been thinking about this idea of enterprise energy as well, because every time you make a change in a company, Ved, it sucks up energy from that company. I mean, just think about, you have a global sales force and everybody has a vertical and a territory and a list of customers, and they have a strategy and a business plan to go after that. And then leadership changes their territory. I mean, the amount of energy that gets expended to then stop and start again is enormous. So I see that whenever there's change through digital transformation or just regular business change, that sucks up energy. So how do you actually monitor? Does my company have enough energy, that resilience to actually change again? Or should I wait 6 months and let us kind of recoup from the last round of changes we've done? Fascinating. So the evolution of interfaces, when I think of interfaces, I think this is, maybe it's between humans and information, or, it's like sign language around a campfire in front of a cave, and then it became grunts. So the interface between people are these grunts or these languages that become grammar and proper language, to then paper and then to computers. What's next, Ved?
Well, I think if you progress further down that path that you were just describing, you'd get to a point where we start using intermediaries for communicating. So we're not talking person to person, we're talking through something else. That something else might have been a smoke signal to start with, and then it became a telegraph system and a telephone system, and today it's a computer. But we've pretty much, in our mindsets, been used to this idea that when we type on a computer or we send an email or whatever it is we're doing, we are basically using a set of intermediary elements, but ultimately it's a human-to-human communication. Because at the other end of that, somewhere, is a human being who will take a decision based on what I've just put in. That could be a credit card approval or a bank loan or whatever it is. Now, going back to your point on decision automation, we may be getting to a point where we are fundamentally going to be in a world of human to machine. There will be no human at the other end in some scenarios, right? A decision, a feedback loop, a response may come from a bot or a very smart supercomputer. Whatever it is, we are not talking human to machine. And so you get a second kind of interface. And this will also be driven through things like Internet of Things, where there is no screen, right? There is no interface as we've known it. You're not typing something, right? Maybe you're gesturing, maybe you're looking, maybe just noticing that you went by. And that also is a kind of an interface in a way. So we're talking to machines. Machines are reading things that we are not necessarily actively typing in. And I think I call this a vanishing interface, that there is no interface anymore. Right? And so it changes the notion of design as well, because we're no longer designing a screen, we're designing an environment, an experience. And then lastly, we'll get to a stage where there are machine-to-machine interfaces, which is almost, it just happening behind the scenes. It doesn't bother us, right? This is, you put your washing machine on, and your smart washing machine talks to your smart meter, and then your smart meter talks to your grid, and says, well, hang on a second, it's not 6 o'clock in the evening now, but the cost of electricity is much cheaper after 11 o'clock at night. So I'm going to hold on to this, and I'm going to run the machine at 11 p.m. because that's when you get the best price for electricity. And this set of communications is a completely machine-to-machine communication. It's happening behind the scenes. It's intelligent. It is decision automation in the sense that we talked about. It doesn't involve humans, but still there are a series of interfaces between machines that are doing all this work for you. And that's quite clever. If you think about it, we're getting into a world where, you go to sleep and you wake up, and many things and many tasks have been done for you while you were asleep. In some ways, that's very cool. It should be life-changing for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot more to be discovered on how to do it well.
Oh, yeah. Every time I read about these, the advances in the latest versions of Tesla, the amount of thinking that goes on in those cars beyond what humans are even paying attention to is enormous. Man. So in your book, Ved, you also talk about this notion of living in the network. Tell us more about that.
This is something very close to my heart. I think what I've realized is that, if you ask someone, where do you live? You get one kind of answer. If you say, well, where do you do your living? Where do you spend your 24 hours? You'll get a slightly different answer, because you'll say, well, I spend 8, 10, 12 hours at home. I spend X number of hours in office, and I spend the remaining amount in transit probably, and some of it in external spaces, in malls, and it's, wandering around. And if you start to think of each of these physical spaces, you start to realize that actually many of them are already networks, and especially in the way we interact with those spaces. At work, we of course are very used to, you go into work, you put your laptop on, you're obviously talking over a local area network, over the internet, and you know that part of the network, and that all has existed for a long time. So we're very comfortable with that. But increasingly, when you come back home, and again, you and I spoke earlier in this conversation about things we do with our mobile phones, and we turn on the heaters, and we switch the TV on, or we record a program, or we warm our cars. That is now starting to obviously become a home network, and you're just plugging into that home network when you reach home. And through a device, through a set of interfaces, through your presence, you are starting to engage with that network. And your car is yet another network, because as you know, cars have lots and lots of onboard software and computers. They are connected to this thing called CAN, which is the CAN bus, which itself is a network and makes the car a network. So what we're doing is we are going from one network to the next network to the next network as we live our lives. And when all these individual networks connect up, that's really the future of the internet. It's really a network of networks. And what is fascinating to me is that there are certain features of networks, and people who study network science have looked at how resources get allocated within networks, how networks shape, how you can predict the behaviors of networks. And that's why I think as we become more and more network oriented in our lives, for us to understand how networks behave, and be able to predict the value of networks, will increase the quality of our lives. And that's why I think it's important that we start to understand networks as well. And this kind of relates back to a conversation that you and I have had in the past about ecosystems, because ecosystems are really networks. They're complex networks of individually independent components, but that also behaves like a network. And for us to be able to predict behaviors, patterns, the behavior of the network as distinct from behavior of individuals is really important, because that's where the really big stuff happens. If you talk about supply chains and macroeconomics, that's really network behavior that we sometimes struggle to compute.
No, such a fascinating topic as well, because when we look at modern manufacturing, it's rarely the case today that one manufacturer will develop, design, and manufacture all their own components. They're looking to dozens or hundreds of other companies that are specialists in their area, and then bringing that together within your use case and product. But that takes an ecosystem, and it takes all kinds of macro and micro networks, as you said, as well.
I speak about design thinking in the book as well. And design thinking has become like a buzzword. Everyone wants to do design thinking, right? As though it's the answer to all problems. And I think that design thinking is fundamental. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. And where I'm coming from on the network side is, I think systems thinking it allows you to build that complementary side to design thinking, because design thinking is very narrow. It looks at one individual or set of individuals and our problems. And the network thinking allows you to look at unintended consequences. If I press this button here, what goes off somewhere else that I'm not aware of? And so it's really important that we start to combine design thinking with systems thinking and network thinking, because that's only the only way we will get to the really comprehensive solutions rather than local optimization.
Oh, yeah. What came to mind when you were saying that is, we buy smartphones and everybody loves their smartphones, but there's consequences to owning a smartphone. Those rare earth materials are being dug out of the ground somewhere. And there's consequences of that as well. And you see the same thing with the lithium batteries and stuff. Those don't make themselves. Those are, materials that are coming from somewhere. And where are they coming from? And what's the environmental impact of mining that kind of stuff? And we all need to start paying attention to all of our electronics as well, and just realizing that our quick purchase of an iPhone does in fact have whole earth consequences ultimately. And so even if that's an issue now, we need to be looking for solutions for that. So up to now, Ved, in history, and just over the last few years, AI has become the buzzword and it's everywhere. But most of the applications to date are still fairly narrow applications within companies. It's going to do this for you or this for you, but it doesn't have a broader perspective or insight as an AI system. When's that going to change? And when's AI really going to be an effective tool at the level of a C-suite?
So, Kevin, you're a futurist, and as a futurist, you know that it's always tricky making predictions. And I think it was Yogi Berra that said, it's even harder making predictions about the future. I think that where we are with AI is really interesting, because we sometimes forget that AI has not been around for that long. We're talking about something that's, a few decades old, depending on what you count as a starting point. A lot of people will point to the 1950s when the word, kind of appeared, but really it's in the last couple of decades that we've seen the real growth, thanks to GPUs and data and machine learning frameworks and methodologies. So we're absolutely at the very, very foothills of what is possible. But already we talked about decision automation. We're seeing the early stages of that. So if I break that down into what does that really mean? Well, sometimes it means pattern recognition. Sometimes it means sorting. Sometimes it means selecting things out of finding the odd man out in a cluster of products, right? Some of that is what AI has become good at. Image recognition is a great example. There's the one area. Well, I think two areas where AI has started outperforming humans reasonably consistently. One of them is image recognition. So when you get to things like, is this X-ray look like there's something on it? Does it need a second opinion? Could it be something malignant? Those are scenarios where certainly we are seeing AI, obviously, maybe in tandem with a doctor, becoming a second voice. It's almost your second medical opinion. Mm-hmm. When we come to those kinds of scenarios, I think we're already kind of on the cusp of mainstream adoption of certain types of AI. And that's still quite narrow, as you said. I think what has been obviously fascinating over the last, I would say, 6 weeks is the explosion of generative AI. And I think people, again, mistake generative AI for what it's not. And of course, it can't do maths, and of course, it doesn't get stuff right. But we're talking about something that can be creative. And I think that's the really powerful, maybe scary thing, that an AI engine can be creative. It can create a story without having to copy from something. It can create art without having to copy from something. And it is actually lifting bits and themes from here and there, which is what we do, right? I think it was, if I remember correctly, Bob Dylan said that, you never write a song originally. You're always singing into a tradition. You start singing something, you start singing a song, and then you kind of morph it in your mind. It becomes your song. But there's nothing that's, absolutely original. You're always borrowing from something. And much the same way, I think what AI is doing today is like humans, is borrowing from things, but it's creating new stuff. And that, I think, is a really interesting thing. And I think where we're getting to in the future will be specifically things like combinatorial tech, when we combine things like digital twins, robotics, and then we throw AI into that. Or when we look at, augmenting human work, using, data capabilities as superpower, predictive capabilities, where AI can more accurately tell you where the most likely accidents might occur on the streets of London or New York. And then you can have ambulances perhaps within half an hour of those spots. So you might save half a dozen lives. That's when you start to think about the real power of this. So I think that, there will not be a single one moment when we say, okay, now we are there. But I think we won't notice that how it creeps into different aspects. And lots of times I think it's quite invisible, because I already see that if you pick up your phone and you take a photograph, there's AI in that device that, today a smartphone looks at the light, manages your aperture, takes the perfect photograph for you, and it can identify people in the picture. It can blur things, and it can look at the foreground and background. So you're already using a ton of AI, right? Now, a conversation I was having with somebody else recently is that if you look at a lot of companies today, and if you look at, let's take this company X, it makes widgets and it sells them. If you were to start this company today, would you design it the same way, or would you design it differently? And the chances are that you would design it very differently, because ultimately, a company is all about resource allocation. You're taking in X, you're producing Y, and you're basically kind of balancing inputs and outputs and making a profit. And there's a whole bunch of decision making that goes on in there. And everything we've been talking about in this discussion is all about how we make decisions and how we can start to automate those decisions. So I think there is certainly a scenario where, maybe not the C-suite to start with, but certainly, many aspects of decision making in organizations will be augmented by AI in the next decade for sure. And at some point of time, we will be talking about, can this be better done by AI or by humans? And then, we can then live our lives more engaged in the pursuit of happiness.
Oh yeah. I have this notion that I've been pondering lately, Ved, which is, if we can imagine a factory where all the machines have AI running them, so the quality improvement, the maintenance, the vibration levels, the inputs, outputs, those are all being measured and monitored by AI. We could call that very defined, narrow AI. Above that, you could have a floor manager, which is an AI system that looks at all of the machines, because its task is to keep the entire assembly line moving efficiently. So it's not looking individually at the machines, it's looking at the assembly line. And then perhaps you have a factory-wide supervisor above that, which is an AI system looking at all the materials coming in, all the products going out, all the different components, and looking at the higher level numbers. And I can see that continuing to roll up and be developed. So ultimately, at the board level, you have a board meeting where your AI system next to you reports on, 213 manufacturing sites and the performance based on all the numbers and KPIs that came out of the AI supervisors and managers. Does that sound like something that ultimately would happen from your perspective?
I think we should certainly think of that as a scenario, right? And I think this is where this conversation and this trajectory has to be balanced with, it's not just a technology question, and it's not just an economic question, because sure, if you just take those two angles, if not in 10 years, in 20 years, it will happen, right? But then there's a societal question, and there's a human question as to, this very famous story about, if all of the work is automated, then who's going to earn the money to buy the stuff that this factory is producing?
Yes.
Right. So we've got to square the circle, and I think the real challenge is that if in the example you talked about, who benefits from this automation, right? If it all gets concentrated into the hands of 3 people, then what happens to the remaining, 8 billion of us, right? So I think it'll become a question about balancing the benefits of AI vis-a-vis the distribution of those benefits across a wider population. And then this will become political, this will become a social issue. But I think we're on that path inexorably. So we will be having these discussions more and more as we go. So if you're having this conversation in 5 years' time, I'm sure we'd be much further down some of the scenarios, and this will be a much more real conversation.
Ved, I want to thank you so much for writing the book that gives us so much insight, and for sharing your thoughts and answering questions about the book. So thank you so much, Ved. And the book, again, let me pop it up here, is called Doing Digital. Yes. The Guide to Digital for Non-Technical Leaders. Ved, congratulations on that, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin. It's been great.